Hey there, friends. Welcome to another episode of Strange Planet. And if you'd like to get a little deeper into Strange Planet, you might want to consider becoming a premium subscriber. It's real easy to do. Just click on the link in the episode description, strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm, strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm. There are three subscriber tiers to choose from. You gain access to commercial-free listening, special bonus episodes produced exclusively for premium subscribers, and you also receive my monthly newsletter, Inner Sanctum, strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm. What really happened in Shelburne Harbor on October 12th, 1960? We're going to find out right now. It's a book by Chris Stiles called Sweep Clear 5, NATO's UFO Encounter. And Chris Stiles is an active UFO researcher who investigates select classic and current UFO incidents that have occurred in Atlantic Canada. He holds to a blended view of the UFO phenomena that allows room for both the ETH and significant psychological component. He's best known for his work on the 1967 Shag Harbour Incident and has presented at several MUFON symposia in both Canada and the US. Chris served as a paid technical advisor with several Canadian UFO feature documentaries, such as Ocean Entertainment's The Shag Harbour Incident and Northern Lights. He's appeared in several U.S. UFO specials, such as Canada's Roswell and UFOs II, Have We Been Visited? In 2019, Chris appeared in an episode of Ocean Mysteries with Celine and Fabien Cousteau. He is the author of two UFO books on the Shag Harbour Incident, Dark Object with Don Ledger and Impact to Contact with Graham Sims. His most recent book, again, is Sweep Clear 5, NATO's UFO Encounter, available from Amazon. In 2023, MUFON Canada presented Chris with an honorary membership in recognition of his lifetime achievement in ufology. Chris Stiles, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
I'm like a teenager, and it's a pleasure to be here, Richard.
Great to have you.
Looking forward to it.
Most people are familiar with the Shag Harbour incident in 1967. This
hmm
one in Shelburne Harbor, 7 years earlier, most people are not familiar with. First of all, let's just kind of give us a little bit of a geography lesson. The um, Shelburne Harbor in relation to Shag Harbour.
It's about 25 miles away as the crow flies, and again, Southwest Nova. It's that end of the province. Shag Harbor more or less faces and looks out into the Gulf of Maine, whereas Shelburne would more empty directly into the Atlantic Ocean. Um, It's during the war, it served as a backup harbor for Halifax, and it's just a small town and community nowadays, but it used to be the location for Canada's most secret military base throughout the Cold War, which was Canadian Forces Station Shelburne, basically a U.S. base on Canadian soil. It was the coordination center for submarine detection in the Atlantic and connected 64 SOSA stations, sonar, and had other systems come ashore there. It operated under a cover story, which the U.S. Navy has since admitted to. And that's where it all happened and played out.
So, care to speculate as to why we know a fair bit about Canada's Roswell, as it's been called, Shag Harbour in 67, and so few of us probably know so little about the Shelburne incident?
Well, let me just say, first of all, with Shag Harbor, that when I started, even Stanton Friedman hadn't heard of it.
Hmm.
That it was only my reinvestigation, which began in April 1992, that led to that. Shag Harbor, however, developed very quickly. And if there wasn't Shag Harbor, I would not have found the Shelburne case. Here's the strange thing. Shelburne masqueraded for years, and that's what I'd always felt as the end of the story of the Shag Harbor incident. But people were always unable, that had told me this story, had witnessed it, had played some part in the role, were always reluctant and unable to give dates or what ships were involved. The telling of the story, the quality of it, the witness testimony compelled me to believe that it was a genuine incident. But let me tell you, when I first heard it, it was first related to me. I can remember the very first time I heard the Shelburne story. It was Good Friday, 1994, almost exactly a year after I began researching Shag Harbor. And when I first heard it, you'd think a lot of people thought, oh, wow, this is what ufologists want to hear. It must have been exciting. Not at all. When I first heard it at the time, it was a year into Shag Harbor. I'd not been involved with any UFO group or attempted to do any research. It was purely personal interest. I'd had the guidance of people very early on, such as the late Stanton Friedman and others, with Shag Harbor. But when I first heard this story, and it couldn't be any different, made me think of Sesame Street, where you have one of these things that's not like the other.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first heard it, I was really kind of cheesed off about it because, suddenly I had this great little crash scenario that had all this mile-wide paper trail, all this documentation, living witnesses, so much heritage to it, right? And then this story, to me, which seemed quite separate as related by the Navy divers, where we're having aliens in the water, UFOs there, a dozen American ships, a dozen Canadian ships, a NATO mission gone wrong, and all this. And, I thought, here we go. And at the time, I was aware of the problems that began early on in the investigation of Roswell. And I thought, well, there goes my neat, clean, tidy, certain, well-documented UFO crash scenario. And now I've got more than one location, and I have, aliens in the water and no paper and all this. And I wasn't the least bit excited about it. But, you cannot pick and choose your data, right?
Right.
And, but everybody around me was helping me at the time with Shag Harbor, local people like the late Bob McDonald, like Don Ledger and others, their attitude was, well, gee, the Shelburne story, this is the meat and potatoes of it. And it's obviously, well, I wasn't in the mood for meat or potatoes. And I thought, no. If this is true, this is a very separate case. There were little clues and things in it that just did not speak of 1967. And I'm going to tell you, as I ultimately found out and even have some memory of, the difference between 1960 and 1967 is huge. Yes, it's 7 years, but the attitude. I mean, in 1960, Dwight Eisenhower was still president, right?
Yes.
People still trusted their government. Imagine that.
Yeah.
It was a very different time.
Before the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah. None of this had played out.
Can I just stop you for a minute, Chris, just for clarification?
Can.
Because earlier on you said that what ended up being the Shelburne Harbor incident in 1960 got tagged on to the end of the Shag Harbour incident. So in other words, somehow they became conflated.
Yeah, they did because, at the time, like I say, I was about a year into my reinvestigation, and initially I had found and talked to the fishermen, to the reporters, had done a lot of research in Ottawa, had gone there physically and sat there and went through a lot of the paperwork. And, those were heady days. I was so excited. Like things happened very quickly. And as the document record demonstrated, it was quite clear the Canadian government believed that this was a genuine UFO incident, and most likely the penetration of our skies and defense systems by something extraterrestrial or extra dimensional, whatever, So, these were great things. And then suddenly, when I tried to find some of the divers, I got a list of all the 7 divers who had dove on the Shag Harbor incident. As I tracked them down, the man who first put it on to me, who at the time was in charge of the fleet diving unit at Maritime Command in Halifax, the first thing he said when I tracked him down and was asking who was there, he said, well, Chris, he goes, you know about Shelburne, don't you? And I said, well, gee, Shelburne, that's Shag Harbor's in Shelburne County. Is that what you mean? And he laughed. He said, oh, no, 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 no. He says, Shelburne, he said, Shag Harbor was a UFO incident, but Shelburne, he goes, there was no doubt. And, you know, the other guys with him, they'd all nod and say, no, 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 there was no doubt of what was going on there. And I'd say, yeah, okay. And they go, well, when you talk to the guys at Dove, they'll tell you. And they gave me a list and said that a couple of the guys had dove on both incidents. You know, they had long careers. So I started with them, and especially with the advice that one was more apt to talk than the rest. And when I made the contact, and I called right away, there would have been no time to prep him or whatever. The first thing he said is, oh, yeah, yeah. He goes, you know about Shelburne, don't you?
Mhm.
And same thing. So I arranged to meet face to face and go to the home. And this diver told me this incredible story that in Shelburne Harbor, and you know, I would ask him about Shag Harbor and my understanding of it, and he would say, "Oh yeah, yeah, that was a UFO incident." By the time we got there, it was all over, though. You know, when the naval search began. You know, but he said that wasn't the case in Shelburne. We got there, things were still going on, and I'm saying, well, is this the same time, the same year? And he says, oh, no, the first guy says it was earlier. I couldn't tell you the year of the ships. He goes, I think it was back around the Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course was October 62.
Mhm.
But none of the others could even name a date generally or whatever. He tells me that they were down there on a training mission for minesweeping, hence the name of the mission. And that was the actual name of the NATO mission, Sweep Clear 5.
Ah,
So and you know, in those days, Canada still had a 60-ship navy, right? So we used to do a lot of NATO missions, right? In fact, we had a ship that was just geared up to be a floating command center for NATO missions, which was HMCS Cape Scott
mhm.
in Halifax, right? The Cape Scott was about 500 feet in length almost. It looked like a supply ship, but it was much more than that. It was a floating headquarters, a factory repair vessel, and had multiple roles, right? So anyway, you know, he was telling me this story, you know, and he said, well, we were down there, as he put it, I think it was frigging around with some British influence mines they had developed, you know. They always had us trying some new stuff out. And he said, we laid this course and we were about to go through it. And he said, my God, we started that day. We're only an hour into the mission. And there we are. We come upon these two UFOs sitting on the seabed. And he said, we're in shallow water. He said, we weren't worried about decompression or anything. And he goes, there's activity. And it was like pulling teeth at this point. And he said, I can't really go into it too much. I said, what do you mean activity? He goes, there were live aliens in the water around the craft.
Wow.
And yeah, so, you know, he tells me the story and it gets very reluctant to go into great detail, but, you know, it had the ring to truth. And when I would push his buttons, Richard, you'd see the emotion. Now, divers like this, you know, particularly somebody with a career, you know, as a clearance diver in the Navy, they do a lot of nasty work. They sometimes have to haul their friends out of down Sea Kings or crash and mishaps. And, you know, these guys, you know, we talked shop when I first went to the home on that Good Friday for some length. And this guy and his colleagues, when they open up, it was like, you know, it was emotional for them. And, you know, I never forgot that. And it was one of the reasons I didn't dispense with the story. To be honest, I wasn't quite ready to go there. And I was very tough on myself all through the reinvestigation of Shag Harbor to come up with the paperwork, to come up with the proof, to investigate the alternate explanations. You know, I was my own skeptic, you know. And with Shelburne, it proved to be a much tougher nut to crack. And be honest, as the book demonstrates, you know, for those who venture through it, it took me 29 years to convince me that this was a genuine incident and that at that point I could name the ships, the date, you know, and what played out.
Sweep Clear 5, NATO's UFO encounter. Chris Stiles is with us. We'll take a quick time out, back with more of our conversation right after these. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Serrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Serrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Serrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. Welcome back. You know about Canada's Roswell, the Shag Harbour UFO incident in 1967, but this is the Shelburne Harbor UFO incident. Sweep Clear 5, NATO's UFO encounter. Chris Stiles is with us with a foreword by Martin Willis. After that first diver opened up to you about seeing 2 craft in shallow water off of Shelburne Harbor and actual entities, entity / divers on the outside or underwater on the outside of these craft. Did he put you on to another diver that he was working with, for corroboration?
Yes, he did. And unfortunately, the next diver wasn't in the Halifax area, and it was a phone interview. I always prefer being face to face over phone, over keyboard, over whatever. The more intimate, the better. I often include in lectures like the value of that. You hear what's going on in the room, you see the reaction of a spouse or whatever, and it's all part of like doing a proper investigation. But yeah, he put me on to somebody else. And it was interesting because the other one eventually turned out to be a work colleague years later and somebody who, I viewed with, every bit of respect possible. And they told me essentially the same thing. And again, very reluctant witnesses, confirmed the details. And, but I still didn't know what to do with it because I thought, wow, what's the chance of getting any paperwork on this? The incredible thing is that the second witness that spoke to me in depth, now these are the men who were actually there. They were under the water when it happened, when first contact is made. He tells me that he actually filmed the event.
Wow.
On underwater, like old would have been 35 mil. Yeah.
35.
And of course, which leads to the obvious question, what happened to this film? Where did it go? And I'll tell you the level, Richard, the degree of answer I was getting is that the film, when a few days later, they were sent ashore from the ship while the ship was still holding station over these USOs, by the way. And they drove it to Halifax to the Defense Research Board on the Dartmouth side. There's a little brick building. It's still there to this day. And they turned it over to Dr. Maurice Coffey and Jason Greenblatt at the Defense Research Board. And of course, being the Navy, you never hear back about it, right? I can remember the level of detail. They took it up in an old Army deuce and a half they used to call Old Sid that was really kind of a cantankerous rig to drive and depend on, right? And they turned it over, and that's the last they ever hear about it, of course, right?
So the divers, they didn't give it to their superiors. Were they attached to the HCMS Cape Scott or?
Yeah, they were actually. And that's significant too, because, in 1960, things were a little different in the Canadian Navy. Again, one more thing that put the distance between 67 and 60. In 1960, divers would be assigned to ships, and most, like Canadian naval ships, would have had at least two that were stationed aboard, and diving was a trade then, you know. And the thing is, like, by 67, divers were just mostly pooled within the fleet diving unit and would be sent to whatever. But 1960, yeah, these guys were part of the ship. And, you know, but it was years before this unfolded because none of them wanted to name the ships. And,
I'm
you
just
know,
curious as to why they wouldn't have been required to give that film footage to their superior, their commanding officer aboard the Cape Scott, rather than take it directly to that building in Dartmouth.
well, I mean, it was brought up like I'd, I'd have to jump ahead because there were things. Okay, let's go there. You know, we only have a certain amount of time. Here's the big surprise that I find now. None of the men claimed this at the time. They'd said that when they first encountered, of course, they're like, "What the?" You know, they had that reaction, and when they're talking to the surface, you know, and let them know at first up, they're not believing what these guys are saying even for a minute. Once they realize it's true and confer with the sonar men and others, and they're saying, man, you know, we're shooting the film footage, right? They yank them out of the water. Everybody comes to the surface. And as they put it to me, all hell broke loose. And some of them used the term that we went to an emergency action station. Firearms were handed out as if we were being boarded. And you got to remember now, on this mission, Sweep Clear 5, which again, I never learned until 2022, it was a NATO mission. There were 10 U.S. warships involved and 8 Canadian, plus a diving tender that would have been the size of a tugboat. And, you know, I can name all the ships because they were in Canadian waters within what was only a 12-mile limit then in outer Shelburne Harbor. They were under the command of the Cape Scott, whose captain was Commander Rankin at the time, Angus Rankin. The mission had been designed by Rear Admiral Kenneth Dyer, and he became kind of famous 2 years later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's the Canadian admiral who went against Canadian orders and John Diefenbaker and took U.S. orders during the Cuban Missile Crisis directly and emptied the harbor in Halifax and went out and, you know, like hunted down Soviet subs and, you know, this kind of thing, right? That's a whole other story, although it's touched in the book. Unfortunately, I never got to interview Angus Rankin. He had been passed by the time I knew his role. But I had spoken to other admirals about this, including William Landymore, about this case, right, as it would surface. But here's the thing. Here's the amazing thing. Here's the first shock I got was in 2022, when the case opens up to me, and this is all the result of a dream, by the way, it explains in the book, that causes me to look up something on Wikipedia, and one sentence changed everything. And I had spent years going through archives trying to find the date by accident using little clues that I would gain along the way. So much wasted effort at 40 cents a page from Ottawa often. Mm-hmm. But what happened was, when I get in my hands in 2022 the actual ship's log for October of 1960, I follow the mission assembling down there. The ships, they all get lined up. And one of the first things they had to do, the Americans had gone down days before and laid a dummy minefield. And it was an 8-mile dog-leg course out at the entrance to Shelburne Harbor. And they begin in, and just like the diver had told me in 94. And by the way, when he tells me this story, it's 33 years old, the story, right? Really?
Yes.
At this point, it's 63 years old or whatever, when I finally have the ship's logbook in my hand, and I'm going through it, or a copy of it. And I get to, okay, the mission begins. It says entering swept channel. And he said about an hour in, all hell broke loose. I get to an hour and I'm reading this, and oh my God, there's so much jargon and naval thing because they're commanding 18 ships, right? There's all these communications. 60 minutes, nothing, and my heart's starting to sink a bit. Well, Richard, I get down to 90 minutes. We can allow them that discrepancy after all those years. I get to 90 minutes in, and suddenly I see something I never expected to see. And I've looked between Shag Harbor and other marine cases. I'm used to going through logs and entries, and what do I find? Assume DEFCON 1.
Yeah, you need to
1.
explain what that means.
Okay, in the DEFCON system, you have 5 levels of military readiness, right? Peacetime and everything at the lowest level would be 5. If you look up on Wikipedia or something more scholarly, right, you will find that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest we were to nuclear war with the Soviet Union, we were at DEFCON 3 generally,
Mhm.
and DEFCON 2, for certain things, and that's the highest. It will tell you we've never been at DEFCON 1. This is not true. They're going to have to rewrite the history book here because this is not an internet rumor. This is in the ship's log. Assume DEFCON 1.
Wow.
DEFCON 1 is like you're ready, you're good to go. You
Yeah.
don't have to check with higher authority to deploy a weapon, to shoot, right?
One
Now,
step.
here's the other thing. Like people say, well, Chris, why couldn't this have been a Soviet sub that gave challenge or come across the border? And there were lots of these stories, right? That it's a court martial offense not to record an enemy vessel near one of these operations. And in fact, in the book I got, it was right on the flap of the book when it has the rules for the navigation officer. You would not do that. You know what I mean? Like, and no enemy vessels are reported, in the area at the time, right? What's interesting is they have this encounter, they haul the men out of the water, they go to DEFCON 1, they lower lifeboats. And the men had told me that at the time they lowered lifeboats to put some debris in the boats that they'd picked up that they thought was foam and damage from one of the craft.
Yes.
And they hoist it up. They go to DEFCON 1. They don't stay at that level, they drop it a bit after that. The ships drop anchor. They're huddled together at the mouth of Shelburne Harbor, just past what's known as McNutt's Island. They're in 7 fathoms, 42 feet of water. Now, if this had been a Russian sub, you could have almost looked over the side and see the conning tower sticking up out, right?
Right.
They sit there for a week, well, 4 days, really. The men always used to say a week, but it turned out it was 4 days and never moved. Nobody lifts anchor or whatever, right? And the thing is, that whole time, I mean, it's oh, time to get up.
We're already
Anyway,
awake. We're wide awake.
yeah, yeah. And this was a shock, and I checked so many things. At the time, I'm sure there's probably been some since. I could only find one internet rumor, and I did some searching of a declaration of DEFCON 1, and it was in West Germany back during the time of the wall, again in 1960.
Yes.
And radar detectors thought they had detected Russian bombers coming their way. But no one has ever proved it or found the paperwork a boy remembered from his father, and it just didn't hold water.
Well,
But here,
sorry, but
go ahead.
how did you, was this a simple access to information request to get the logs from the HCMS Cape Scott, or did you have to fly through hoops to get this thing?
Um, it was a simple request. However, remember, I didn't have the date or the names of the ships, right? And well, let me just tell this story of why I requested it at all. Because I had done years. In fact, I had written a chapter in a book that somebody else was going to publish about how I'd given up on the Shelburne story. I'm not known for giving up. I'm saying I admit, I believed what the men had told me. Should somebody walk in and drop it on my desk or give me that final clue, I would pursue it. But I'm done sitting in Ottawa or going. I cried uncle. Okay.
Hmm.
So, and it was Christmas, between Christmas Day and New Year's in 2022, right? And I went to bed. I stayed up all night watching PVR's worth of UFO stuff I'd missed during the holidays, with relatives, friends, and people around. So I was ready to get into this. Mostly it was a rehash or follow ups of the Tic Tac stuff and whatever. And I was interested. That's all great stuff too. I eventually got tired, went to bed, as I put it, surrendered to the sacred night, and I had a dream. And I dreamt that I was 5 years old and under an end table and listening to my father's friends. My father was the medic on HMCS Cape Scott. He had never told me anything of the Shelburne mission or whatever. And I dreamt it, and I woke up, and I didn't trust the dream or whatever. The only thing it caused me to do, Richard, was I went to the computer, opened it up, went to Wikipedia, because I was trying to wonder, what is the classification of the Cape Scott? I knew Dad was on it. I knew it was, a supply ship, but it was more than that. I read up on it. When I get to the service history of the ship, the last sentence says, in 1960, HMCS Cape Scott took part in a NATO mission called Sweep Clear 5 in Shelburne Harbor, period. That's all it says. Well, all the years of searching and all the logs, I had never was able to put any Canadian warship in Shelburne Harbor during the Cold War. So, except for a one-day visit, which was planned, announced weeks before by the Fraser in '67 to show off our new invention, the bear trap, which allows them to land helicopters on the deck, and they were going to go to Washington to show it off to the Americans. So I saw that and I thought, oh my God, that's got to be it. And I was like, don't get too excited. It was the holidays. The next day I went to a used bookstore and went through old military magazines, figuring it would take a couple of months to have any bragging rights or coverage. The Navy used to have a magazine called The Crow's Nest. I found a copy from December 1960. Ironically, had the bounty on the cover because they were making the movie with Marlon Brando.
Right.
Anyway, I read, and here was coverage of Sweep Clear 5. It named all the ships, Canadian and American, involved in the mission, what the mission was supposed to be about, said who was the admiral that designed the mission at Maritime Command, which was Ken Dyer, who was in charge, et cetera, right? And when you read it, it was like one of those typical naval articles. Oh, and a good time was had by all. No life like it, right? So I had that, and I thought, well, I got to put in these requests. The first thing, though, was I went back to the computer because I had ships' names, right? And I started looking them up. And the first thing I found was, you read the Canadian thing, a good time was had by all. I go to the American version. Well, there was nothing under Sweep Clear 5. But when I look at the service history of ships like USS Yazoo, which was part of the mission, I look at the Yazoo, and it says that on October 15th, a few days afterwards, HMCS Cape Scott had to be rescued by USS Yazoo, which had complete engine failure and was drifting and going to ground on the shore of Shelburne Harbor. And at the last minute, she had been ordered with all ships to leave the harbor immediately. And it had to go back and tow the Cape Scott to safe anchorage. So that, and on and on and on, there was these discrepancies. So I thought, wow, I got to go right to the source. The first thing I found was that when I tried to request, I wanted one of the ships that had been a diving tender, but supposedly its log hadn't been preserved. The diving tender's log, the YTM-8, hadn't been preserved, and it wasn't looking good. So I thought, well, let's go right for the command ship. And they did have Cape Scott. It took 7 months to get it beyond the act. And I've had some experience with that. I only had that happen once before, but when it came and I started to sift through it, lo and behold, there it was. And my first reaction, of course, to back up a bit, when I saw the Wikipedia article, oh my God, my father was there, because I knew he was posted on the boat in those early years. Wow. DEFCON-1, Dad was there.
Oh my Lord.
And then I got the thing, and things went a little quicker from there. But there's a lot to do yet on this case. But, after 29 years, I had to get a book out. I'm just like, oh my God, it was like a weight off my shoulder, Richard. It was a vendetta. It was a quest.
We'll take another time out, Chris. Mind-blowing stuff. Stay with us. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. Chris Stiles stays with us, Canadian UFO researcher, of course, best known for his work on the famous Shag Harbour UFO incident. But this one predates Shag Harbour by more than 7 years. And it's the October 12th, 1960 Shelburne Harbor. I guess we should call it a USO incident.
Correct. Yes.
Prior to the discovery of these craft on the bottom of Shelburne Harbor in about I think you said 6 fathoms of water.
Yeah.
Were
7.
there were any incidents, lights in the sky prior to that, or is this strictly an unidentified submerged object incident?
Yes, there were no civilian witnesses to this, right? Possibly, it's possible that the nearby lighthouse on McNutt's Island may have seen something enter, but the lighthouse logs for this period, again, were unavailable. There's a lot of unavailable. So I was very lucky to get the command ship on this, believe me. The other thing that was interesting, so many things, and you find this in the book, of course, is that these guys the couple that dove, and only one of them had a career that overlapped, it turned out, in the end, with, the Shag Harbour divers. He never spoke of Shelburne to them, believe it or not. The next group of divers that I heard about it, and they had secondhand information and they heard openly all about the case, were the women in the so-called 1984 experiment that were the first officers to take command and become RCN divers on the Cormorant in 1984. And the diver who had dove on both missions, was a consultant and a trainer to them. And he felt comfortable talking to them because whenever he tried to talk to the guys, that he worked with in the years afterward that hadn't been at Shelburne, he'd tell the story, you'd mention it, they'd all make the sound of a theremin or whatever, right? But this next generation of divers, these women, right? They felt comfortable. They grew up, they were the generation lost in space. They accepted it at face value. And this gentleman felt comfortable relating it to them. And I found that very interesting and a little sad, But, there was, of course, rumors of this within the community of Shelburne, because Shelburne also had what was, again, Canada's most secret base, the Coordination Center for Submarine Detection, right?
Right.
And, these things circulated in the community. The other thing you got to remember about that, it's another example of how I say, Richard, one of these things is not like the other. Because in 67, this base was shared 50-50, like a NORAD arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1960, it was U.S. only, right? Flew only, Old Glory. If you worked there, you had to be in U.S. forces, right? So they had control of this. I mean, they were caught unprepared in this, and it was amazing that they were able to keep this so dark and such a lid. But then again, the function of the base was hid until there was a scandal in the 90s. because they dismissed 5 officers, accused them of being in an open lesbian relationship and, vulnerable to espionage. Gay service members had no rights then.
Mhm.
But in 1960, you see, U.S. base only. You have this top secret base nearby operating under a cover story. Um, it was all a sensitive thing, right? And we were unprepared. The defense minister at the time, Doug Harkness, under John Diefenbaker, assumed the job, get this, the day before on October the 11th
Wow.
of 1960. So, they were all caught napping on this.
Back to the divers that saw these craft on the ground, on the bottom of the Shelburne Harbor. How much detail did they get into in describing the entities and the craft themselves?
It was like pulling teeth, that part of the interview. Several times, like they'd look at the ground and, they wouldn't, what I mean, or the floor of their kitchen or whatever, they wouldn't maintain eye contact, and they'd put out their hand and say, Chris, you have to move on. We can't talk about that. But eventually the details revealed that these were typical grays in the water. I couldn't get comment about equipment if they required special diving or whatever. Again, we're in a maximum of 42 feet of water at 7 fathoms. But yeah, they were typical grays, and they sat over this thing, and we do know from the ship's log. Of course, there were no mention of, there never is in deck logs why things happen. Simply that, a ship was sunk or men were hurt or a chopper. What we do know afterwards is the man who, like I say, is infamous in Canadian history for taking U.S. orders through the Cuban Missile Crisis, Admiral Kenneth Dyer. and the jury's out on him. People describe him as a hero or somebody who circumvented democracy. Those are your choices, right? He flew out to the mission after this for what it calls a hot wash-up meeting with the Americans aboard ship on the Cape Scott. And here's what we do know. Are you ready for this? Is that there was an incident aboard ship, and it happened to be one of the divers that spoke to me. That's all I'll say. These are the only 2 men that have, a pseudonym in the book, right? In fact, in this, I reveal the actual names of all the Shag Harbour divers and explain why I do that in it, because they'd gone public and hadn't even realized it somewhere else. Anyway, here's the thing. While they're having this hot wash-up meeting, a protocol officer wanders downstairs into the mess, and he's kind of interested because, hey, there's liquor aboard, Canadians are drinking, right? He goes in. The divers are sitting in a corner in a huddle. And they were there, they'd been for days. And somebody else who had worked with another work colleague who was Air Force remembered this and told me this story years later. I connected. I couldn't believe he'd been on the mission. He was there for a consultant. They never showed him anything. He said, it's the strangest mission I ever been on. He said, I'll tell you what was going on. And these guys were in the corner talking about what they were sitting over. This U.S. officer doesn't like this, the way they're talking openly. He walks over and leans in on them, says, guys, he goes, you shouldn't be talking shop. At least you guys get a beer. We have to have just a Coke. He said, you shouldn't be talking about that Soviet sub we're sitting over. Mm-hmm. And one of the divers, the fella, it turned out I interviewed, just explodes. He jumps up and the table goes over. He grabs the American and he says, that's the trouble with you Yankee boys. You see the red menace everywhere. He said, the red menace that we're over, he goes, it's not from Moscow or the Black Sea. He goes, it might be Mars. He goes, I suspect a lot farther away. He says, if it wanted to do something, we wouldn't be able to do anything. And, he said, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I hope you guys don't decide to go all John Wayne on it. And he let go of the guy, and the American ran up, and they came back down with the captain. Buddy goes off. Tells him to go sleep it off or he's going to the brig, right? And that occurred down below while they were having the so-called, I love that, hot wash-up meeting with the Americans aboard the ship. They flew them out in helicopters. And by the way, I've had people say to me, stand up to think, 1960 said you couldn't land it on a destroyer, no, but you could land a Labrador on the Cape Scott. It had a special deck, even back then, before the conversion, right?
Ah, so you had mentioned earlier that the Cape Scott had become immobilized somehow and was drifting, was at risk
Yeah,
of coming ashore. Any
yeah.
connection between it? Because that diver just said, if this craft wanted to do something to us,
Well,
just
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's tempting to speculate. I'll tell you what I do know about it, because deck logs are very sketchy, right? And you have to understand the jargon. I'll tell you what it does say is when they first call Maritime Command in Halifax and say cannot comply with order to leave harbor, complete, engine failure, maintaining real slow revs, and they can't fight the wind and they're drifting toward the shore, right? And they want permission to drop anchor, and they're told no, leave the harbor. Well, we can't do it. Go, get out. Like, so something was going on right then and there, right? And this is where the Yazoo comes back
Mhm.
and rescues her. So you have to combine, the oral testimony I'd gotten, right? Now, there are no documents beyond this log to date, but luckily, between the interviews I'd done over the years, including with Admiral Andy Moore about this, he wasn't there. He was, at the time, captain of the Bonaventure, actually. Uh, you know, we uh, we have these insights, right? But you do have to piece it together. As far as the film goes and all that, I don't even know that Ottawa or others would know or have had access to it. Once it went to DRB, and there's a whole chapter in the book that explains how they operated under themselves and answered to no one, that the bench scientists there picked their mission. It was very unusual. This had been set up since the creation of the Defense Research Board. It was a compromise to bring the Navy in, because the Navy was actually its own Defense Research Board. Get this, it started in 42 during World War II.
Wow.
And yeah, they had in that facility, and even to this day, if you look up on Wikipedia about, it's currently called, what is it, Research and Development Canada or whatever. If you look at it now, it explains on there that their mission is a little different from all the other divisions here in Dartmouth. And I love this. One of the mission statement, one of the things they do is control, what is it, information and release about maritime matters, but they keep a lid on everything anyway. But they answer to nobody. They have a black budget, and that's it.
Don't you think this should be Canada's UFO, Canada's Roswell? I mean, Shag Harbor, pretty spectacular in terms of documentation, but in terms of
I
the
agree. I agree. Yeah, because the documentation in Shag Harbour, just nobody had pursued it, before me. It was always unrestricted from source, right? This one, while nobody there could acknowledge that, or is in a position to, and it's dubious how much Ottawa would know about this, or Washington in one sense. The men knew who were there. But this film, for example, at DRB, um, you know, I suspect knowing these scientists and following their career and even interviewing their family members and people, early on like Celine in Ottawa and how they looked at this. It's did he pull a Phil Corso? Did they take this film? Did they just put it in the door and keep it as an academic study from them, right? This would not be beyond the possibility for them, right? And it just slept into the dustbin of history. I could tell you this: the daughter, Marcia Coffey, of Dr. Coffey, who would have been one of the two scientists who received the film, he used to take his daughter on walks and tell her he wished he could talk about it. He says, I'm absolutely sure we're not alone. I've seen the proof at work.
wow. Sweep Clear 5, NATO's UFO encounter. Chris Stiles, forward by Martin Willis. Absolutely astounding information, Chris. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah. Well, it's early days yet in this investigation, right? We have a big conference in Yarmouth this year. We have every year down there, and I'm hoping, it's been a thing last year. A lot of naval personnel came to tell their stories to me personally. I suspect there's a lot more. And when I think about how long and how we still find new things on the Shag Harbour incident, all of which strengthen the interpretation of it being something, I think this year that in September, so last weekend of September, when we have this, I'm hoping more people come forward to tell me their stories, right? And that's why the book at the front is dedicated to these men. There was nothing in it for them to tell this story, and, they were often expected to deal with the unknown. They come face to face. They had no training for it, and they weren't even allowed to acknowledge that it happened.
This has to go down as one of the most important UFO or USO cases ever. Great work, Chris.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. Hello, friends. Welcome to another edition of Strange Planet. Just over a year ago, a book was published by a former hedge fund manager, David Rogers Webb. It's called The Great Taking. In the book, Webb reveals what he calls the taking of all collateral, all of it, as part of the end game of the current globally synchronous debt accumulation supercycle. The scheme is being executed, he says, by long-planned intelligent design, the audacity and scope of which is difficult for the mind to encompass. Included are all financial assets, bank deposits, all stocks and bonds, and hence all underlying property of all public corporations, including all inventories, plant and equipment, land, minerals, deposits, inventions, and intellectual property. Privately owned, personal, and real property financed with any amount of debt will likewise be taken, as will the assets of privately owned businesses which have been financed with debt. If even partially successful, this will be, he writes, the greatest conquest and subjugation in world history. Here to talk about the Great Taking and the work of David Rogers Webb is Mel Madison. He's been with us before. He's a writer, financial services veteran. He leverages over 20 years of experience in the realm of high finance. He brings real-world authenticity to his fictional narratives, having served as the CEO of 3 separate fintech and SEC regulated broker-dealers. Mel combines insider knowledge with a critical eye towards the economic forces that shape our lives, with a knack for deconstructing jargon and making the complex understandable. Mel sheds light on the sometimes dark and confusing corners of finance. He holds an MBA from Duke University and studied creative writing at Loyola University, Chicago. He's the author of Quaz, a financial thriller. Mel Madison, welcome back to Strange Planet. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Thank you for alerting me about this. I wasn't familiar with David Rogers Webb or the book, which has now been turned into kind of a documentary. My understanding is, just based on a little bit of research prior to this podcast, that Webb, again, a former hedge fund manager, now resides in Sweden on a small farm. So let's just dive right in. And I kind of read an excerpt about the book, The Great Taking. You give me your perspective on what is meant by the term, the Great Taking.
Sure. So I think that, a lot of us who have tried to keep abreast of what's going on between, kind of globalist, New World Order, economic agenda, we've seen, kind of a quickening of actions. We've seen the push for things like CBDCs. And what the Great Taking really does is it adds a crucial piece to the puzzle of what could likely be in store regarding a future world economic collapse and ultimately confiscation of assets. And the Great Taking spells out the legal framework that can make this possible. And so it's literally a story that goes back a few decades, but that has been memorialized into law around most developed nations, whether we're talking about the United States, Europe, Canada. And it's a process in the law where all financial assets, especially things like securities such as stocks and bonds, that most people, if they have a brokerage account and they think that they own them, that they really don't. That 83%, for example, in the United States of securities are owned by one individual corporation, a subsidiary actually of the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, or DTCC. In Canada, there's a similar organization called the Canadian Depository of Securities, CDS, owned by TMX, which also owns the Toronto Exchange, as well as other financial platforms in Canada. And so wherever you go in the world, what they've done is they've consolidated all of our assets, and they've put the ownership, the true legal ownership, the property rights, under these corporations, and therefore made them subservient, if you will, to the creditors in the event of a collapse of these organizations, rather than to us as the owners. And what we now own, the legal term they created is a securities entitlement. So we have just a weak contractual claim on what we think are our assets, and they're actually legally owned by these other entities.
All right, so lots here to unpack. Let's just really simplify this so we understand what is at stake. Let's say I have $50,000 cash in a Canadian bank. Would that be affected?
So if that bank is, the banking system is still different than the securities. I don't want to get too technical, but indirectly, yes, that would be affected. Number one, most banks are involved one way or the other in the securities business. And the other aspect, that in the event of a collapse, the spillover, whether they're a brokerage or a bank, will be so widespread that banks, which obviously loan out most of their assets. For example, in the United States, there used to be a 10% requirement that banks keep on their balance sheet. In COVID, that was reduced to zero. So banks are now legally able to loan out any amount of money. And so in the event of a collapse, if your money is in that bank, you might think that, okay, if this bank goes under, then there'll be the FDIC in the United States or a Canadian equivalent.
Yeah, we have a mortgage, not mortgage, deposit insurance, the Deposit Insurance Corporation. So we're covered up to a certain amount, our deposits.
Exactly. And those are actually just small organizations that are owned by the member banks that are not funded to handle a massive collapse. Even just the single collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in the United States pretty much bankrupted the FDIC. And that's why the Federal Reserve had to step in, and they did big special assessments. But that was just one medium-sized bank. You can imagine in a massive financial collapse, there's no way that this money can be safe. I think a really good way to kind of think about this situation with all financial assets is to think about something like a home. So if you own your home, ultimately your name is on a deed with the kind of place of record. In the United States, it might be the county, and you own that. When you think about any type of stocks, let's just take a stock of Apple. Ultimately, the property rights, the ownership of that Apple stock is determined at the level between Apple and the Apple books and records that the Apple treasurer keeps. So, in financial terms, Apple is the issuer of the stock, and then they're required by law to keep records of who owns Apple stock. At one point in time, corporations would issue stock certificates, and you would get that, delivered to you. And on the company books and records, it would record Richard Serret owns 100 shares of Apple, and you were the direct owner of it. In the 1960s and 70s, this paperwork became so strong that at one point, actually, the New York Stock Exchange closed on Wednesdays because they couldn't handle all the paperwork. And they began a process called dematerialization. One of these words that just, you can't even believe it. But so they dematerialize stock certificates. And then what the next layer on this was to not only not have these physical certificates exist anymore unless you go through a very special and time-consuming process, that ultimately it was too much paperwork to keep track of all these individual owners. And so they said, well, we need to put it all under one system and create one true legal owner of all of these certificates. And the kind of machinations go a lot deeper than that, but that was the genesis of it. And then they added layers of complexity to it to make it even easier for any type of future confiscation, and also to put those assets at risk in the event of financial collapse.
All right. So if you have Tesla stock, if you have, stock in a silver mine, it's all the same. Or Apple stock, no more paper certificates. Somehow through these machinations, there is now one legal owner, and that legal owner is the, what did you call it? The clearinghouse, the depositor trust, the Depositor Trust Clearing Corporation.
Exactly.
And all right. So just continuing on with what is affected, you mentioned a home earlier on, and I have a deed on the house. And let's say I don't have a mortgage. Do I still own my house?
Well, not really. And this is how they're going to do this. So ultimately, when you own that deed and you have own that home, you still own that home. And so right now, your home is not owned by the DTCC. There might be a mortgage lien that is wrapped up into a security. And so the lien holder, you might think it's a bank, or it might be a group of investors that ultimately own the mortgage on your home. But actually, since it's securitized, it is owned by one of these clearing corporations. And so right now, the fundamental assets that are owned by these corporations are in some sort of a securitized form. But ultimately, and this is where my work builds a little bit on what David Rogers Webb presents in the documentary, which is a great documentary that I recommend watching on YouTube. But what I've uncovered in my own research is one, a little bit more of the background on the DTCC and who they are and how they're set up. And I've also found out about their plans to add your home directly to their ownership. And so if you, for example, were to go to the DTCC website, and they put these white papers right up there, they have a recent white paper they put up there called the Tokenization of Private Assets, Driving Blockchain Interoperability, Liquidity, and Efficiency. And so their plan now is not only to take all of your securities, which they own, but to what they call tokenize, which is essentially taking the deed of your home, putting it onto the blockchain, and turning it into a security so that it can be traded back and forth. Ownership can be transmitted digitally with the flip of a switch. And they've been doing these big experiments. They call it, at the DTCC, we believe digital asset technology offers exciting potential, where blockchain networks and traditional rails seamlessly integrate. we are committed to supporting the shift from blockchain experiments to production-ready capabilities. And this is for private assets, which would be things like cars, your car deed, your home. And so once this is complete and they're already getting ready for these production-ready capabilities, then not only will all of your securities or stocks or bonds be on this network, but also all what they call private assets, or they refer to it as real-world assets on the blockchain.
Again, even if I own my house outright and I have no mortgage, I don't own it. They own it.
Once this process is complete, right now you're still in a safe zone, but they're moving towards this. Larry Fink talked a lot about this at Davos, the head of BlackRock, that this is the next level. This is like everybody's gotten a little bit of wind of the CBDC, the central bank digital currency plans to move money onto the blockchain. Now they're starting to move financial assets onto the blockchain. And then the final thing is to put what they call real world assets onto the blockchain. And once this process is complete, it's going to be kind of game over. And the situation that they did this legally, like, they do this without permission. And so you might think, well, I'll have to sign this over. But you'll notice that there's a framework to do this without your acquiescence. And they did it, through law in the United States and places like Canada, through what they call the Uniform Commercial Code. So it didn't even require a congressional approval. It's done on a state-by-state basis. In Canada, I looked it up. It's called the Securities Transfer Act, or STA, that each one of the Canadian provinces has passed. It's kind of the same in each province, so that it effectively is a national law, but it's done on a state level. And I found the same terminology of securities entitlement in the Securities Transfer Act of Canada that exists in the Uniform Commercial Code in the United States. And these are the places where it states in there that you are only a beneficial owner. And then what it states is that a creditor of what they call securities intermediary, or the company that actually owns it, DTCC, a creditor under different circumstances, and they enumerate what those circumstances are, can have claim on your assets. And all that you, as a securities entitlement holder, have the right to is a pro rata share, because everything is in a pooled vehicle. There's no direct ownership between you and your security, a pro rata share of what's ever left over once these creditors are paid.
Unbelievable. It's outright theft, folks. That's what we're talking about. Outright theft. Mel Madison, writer, financial services veteran. He is the author of Quaz, a financial thriller. We're talking about the great taking. Back with more in a moment. Stay with us. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. Mel Madison stays with us, writer, financial services veteran. The book is Quaz, a financial thriller, but this is not fiction. We're talking about the great taking. Just over a year ago, I mentioned the book published by a former hedge fund manager, David Rogers Webb, drawing our attention. It's also available as a documentary on YouTube. In the book, the documentary, Webb reveals that all of our property, basically, all of our collateral, all of it, will be taken from us. This is a long-planned scheme, And the real owner of all of our assets, our securities, ultimately our physical assets, our homes, our cars, are in fact owned by the DTCC. That is the Depositors Trust Clearing Corporation. Do I have that right, Mel?
You do. That's correct.
All right. The last time you were on, we talked about the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of all central banks, which is a very secretive institution. And are they ultimately behind this, or who owns the DTCC?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the DTCC, it was originally started, or let's call it its predecessor companies, because there was, different companies that merged into one another until it ultimately got into its current form. But this was something that was started in the 60s and the 70s. And the first CEO and chairman of the DTCC was a guy by the name of William Densner. Now, he died a few years ago at the age of 91. He had served in the United States military during World War II. And after that, and his resume is a little murky, but he got involved with different diplomatic organizations. And at some point, and this is written about in his Wall Street Journal obituary, he was seconded to the CIA for a number of years. And so literally the subtitle of this Wall Street Journal article was "Former CIA Operative Saved Wall Street from Its Paperwork." So it's very innocuously stated, but it's a well-known fact that this entire organization was set up and run by a former CIA operative. So we know that those ties rarely die, even when they leave the company, as it's called, that there's still those connections in place. And so the DTCC itself, much like central banks, like the Federal Reserve, it's owned by the member banks and brokerages. So this is not a private or a publicly held company that has to report its filings and let people know exactly what's going on. This is owned by the stock brokerage firms and the banks of the United States. And they even took it one step further, which is they created, and they have a subsidiary company in there called CD and Co, CEDE and Co, which is set up as an entity in the form of a partnership. Now, not to get too much into, the legal differences between a corporation and a partnership, but one of the key differences of a partnership from a corporation is that any single partner with just the stroke of their pen can transfer the ownership of the assets without it going through a corporate board or having a corporate seal. And so the partners of this subsidiary are the legal holders on the issuer books, and any single partner could transfer these assets. Now, in the United States, the DTCC assets are listed at $87 trillion. And so you have to realize that we have Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos worth $200 billion. The entire United States debt is $34 trillion. The one partner at this company has legal ownership rights to transfer $87 trillion worth of securities.
Wow. Now, you mentioned that the law or the mechanism by which this is now possible, that everything that we own, our securities, our private property, is owned by the DTCC, the Depository Trust Clearing Corporation, which began by this former CIA fellow William Densner. The laws were passed state by state, province by province. Did they understand, when I say they, the provincial legislatures, the state legislatures, the premiers, the governors, did they understand what they were passing, what they were signing, or was that done by stealth? Was this legislation slipped through without their awareness?
No, it was done with their awareness. And this is one of the points that, let me put it this way, it was done with the awareness of the creators of the legislation. I believe that many of the legislative bodies that approved this were unaware of it. And so this is the problem with massive bills, with technical legal jargon that the legislatures or the legislators, the individuals, don't even read themselves. And so it's buried within, a very thick stack of laws. And so, but the people framing it did understand. And one of the things that David Webb shows in his documentary is that when Europe was putting in their similar plans, they wrote a letter to the New York Federal Reserve. And so this is the connection, with, this is supposed to be like a privately thing done by the brokerages, but yet when the Europeans wanted to emulate these laws, they contacted the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they asked them questions such as who ultimately owns the security in the event of bankruptcy of the securities intermediary, the DTCC type entity in Europe. And it was a legal question to explain to the European lawyers. And it explicitly states that no, the individual investor does not own it. It is owned by the securities intermediary. So they put all these things into place. Now, just since this documentary and things have come out, there's been a slow but steady growing awareness of it. And just last month, the state legislature in South Dakota passed a bill, House Bill 1193, which was an attempt to change the Uniform Commercial Code in South Dakota to reinstate, investor ownership. And I forget her first name, Kristi Noem.
Yeah, the governor.
She vetoed the bill that was passed.
Why?
Well, she wrote a letter, which I have up on the screen in front of me here, where this was dated March 9th. So this is very recent, 2023. She wrote it to the Speaker House. I respectfully return to you House Bill 1193 as my veto bill. HB 1193 is an act to amend provisions of the Uniform Commercial Code. She gives reasons for it because there were different things in the amendments, such as there was part of it was to exclude the use of central bank digital currencies. And she said that the definition that the bill gives of money is too broad. And for these reasons, she's going to veto it. She never once mentions anything about the changes that were also made to the securities entitlement provisions. And so this is very suspicious that in her reason for the veto, she mentions she didn't like the definitions in it. And so therefore, South Dakota did not get this passed.
They could override that with another vote. What do they need? What would they need? Another, I don't know how it works. A 2/3 majority in the legislature in South Dakota would override her veto?
Yes, I believe that after this letter, they attempted to or tried to, but they couldn't get the votes. And so it was dead. Now I don't know if Kristi Noem is aware of all these details. I don't know if somebody has gotten to her, but it's definitely a situation where this is a tricky situation because the UCC is, it unifies, so like legally in United States, Canada, these types of laws need to be at the state level. But in reality, we kind of have a de facto federal system. And if one state tries to change their law, and now their law is different from the other 49 states, it almost needs to happen in all 50 states at the same time in order for everything to actually take effect in the proper ways. And then you're seeing these roadblocks being put up because they don't like the definition of money or so on. And so I think, the key to this is really getting more of the information out there, which, we're doing right now, but so that people understand that there's more at stake here than just, a bill for show to say we're not going to take CBDCs, that there was actual material changes to the UCC in here, which were important, which Noem vetoed.
All right, we need to talk about the Universal Commercial Code, the UCC. I remember doing shows years ago where it was suggested or alleged or what have you that the U.S. Constitution was actually replaced by something called the UCC, the Universal Commercial Code. I believe back during the presidency of FDR. So we're talking about the 1930s. The U.S. Constitution replaced by the Universal Commercial Code. Does that make sense?
Well, and just to be clear, it is the uniform commercial code. But again, this is a way of subverting and kind of putting into place whatever they want, regardless of what, say, the Constitution says. So, the Constitution clearly states that there are enumerated authorities of the federal government, and that any of those authorities fall either to the states, which the states have to, through their constitutions, kind of enumerate authorities, and if not, they fall to the people. And so the Uniform Commercial Code, it was one of these ways to essentially federally enact what would be unconstitutional to do federally. So I haven't done a ton of research into the specifics of how this could be a full replacement of the Constitution, for example, but it definitely, in effect, federalized certain aspects of the entire commercial agenda of the United States in a way that the Constitution on its face would prohibit, which is that there's some massive federal body. And then you see exactly the type of issue right now where state legislatures want to make changes to it, and the governor is vetoing it because, it's going to disrupt the synchronicity between all the states that have passed this Uniform Commercial Code. And so it makes it very hard to make changes to it.
And so the plans to basically expropriate all of our property, this was put in place, did you say in the 1990s? So it's been around, 30 years?
30 years, yep. That's when the first instance of securities entitlement was created.
All right. Let's take another time out. Mel Madison stays with us, and we are talking about the Great Taking. Back with more in a moment. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. Mel Madison is with us, writer, financial services veteran, the author of Quaz, a financial thriller, has his MBA from Duke University. And we're talking about a book and documentary by David Rogers Webb, former hedge fund manager, now living on a farm in Sweden. It's called The Great Taking. And all of our securities, all of our private property, basically owned by something called the Depository Trust Clearing Corporation, the DTCC. This was put in place in the 1990s. And so when did they pull the trigger on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So one thing we haven't discussed is how does this whole house of cards come falling down? And again, what I had mentioned earlier is by the true legal owner being this corporation, what the UCC says in Article 8 is that creditors of these securities intermediaries can have claim on all of these assets. So what you have to imagine is a situation where either the major brokerage firms and or the DTCC itself essentially go under. So you have to put on your kind of financial imagination cap and think, how could we have a situation where this all blows up? And there is a clear kind of possible scenario out there.
In other words, the trigger for this is global financial collapse, where the banks go under, the stock market crashes, everything, and so they become the creditors. The owners of the DTCC, they become the creditors when everything falls apart, and they swoop in and take everything.
Exactly. And you have to think about what could be such a collapse that, for example, this $87 trillion worth of assets, and eventually when they would get homes and everything else, how could creditors have claim to that much assets? And the answer is the same culprit of the 2007-2008 collapse, which is the derivatives market. So for example, the market capitalization, if you took the value of all the stocks on the US stock exchange, it's around 25 or 30 trillion. On the Canadian stock exchange, so the Toronto stock exchange, it's $4.2 trillion of, if you add up the value of all those stocks. But what is based upon that is a multi-quadrillion, and a quadrillion is 1,000 trillion, a multi-quadrillion derivatives market. And so this is the same situation where when the mortgages were collapsing in the United States, if you wanted to bail out all of those mortgages, it was only in the hundreds of billions, or maybe, 1 or 2 trillion. But based upon those mortgages were things like collateralized debt securities, mortgage-backed securities, and then there were derivatives on those, credit default swaps. So we get into these technical terms. But what happened is that they had like synthetic CDOs. So you could synthetically own these assets. And through all of this convoluted financial jargon, what you wind up with is a bunch of financial assets based essentially upon these real assets, like a pyramid, but the pyramid expands out in multiples, 100 times multiples. So you might have 30 trillion in US stocks, that's the value of that. But when you add in the options markets and the index markets and the futures markets and the derivatives on those markets, now you're starting to get into those quadrillions. And so when the derivatives market explodes, that is where you can have the leverage in these securities intermediaries, and the counterparties and the overseers of these are precisely the same organizations. So the DTCC is tied into being counterparties and making sure that each side can pay each side in a derivatives like a swap or something like that. And if one of those banks or brokerages can't honor their agreement, these securities intermediaries and clearing firms are on the hook for them. So that's supposedly the purpose that they serve. But of course, in a massive collapse, they're not going to have the collateral or the money to cover these collapses. And so then these creditors are going to have the legal right through the UCC to go at the assets that these companies legally own, and they legally own our securities.
Wow. They own all of our property.
Exactly.
What if I have gold in my safe?
That, barring a physical confiscation, which of course has happened before. So we know that FDR confiscated. This is essentially a repeat in a much larger version of what happened in the 1920s and 30s in the United States, where you had the massive buildup of people putting their wealth into the stock markets and the banks. And so even if you did not play the stock market in 1920s, you lost your assets. Why? Because you had your cash, your money at a bank. The bank was tied into the financial system. The financial system on Wall Street collapsed. Then the banks collapsed. Then when you went to your bank and there were bank runs, the money wasn't there. And so this is the same sort of situation where you don't have to be actively playing the market, invested in these risky derivatives, because your assets are ultimately collateral for these risky derivatives, in the same way that your bank deposits in the 1920s were collateral for the banks playing the stock market.
So when I look around at what's happening here in Canada, for example, and the federal government deliberately trying to destroy our energy industry, all of these caps on emissions and banning coal-fired electricity plants and making it difficult to build pipelines, deliberately trying, it would seem, to destroy not only energy, but also now we see what's happening worldwide with agriculture. Is this, and I always say to myself, if they planned on ruining the economy, they couldn't do a better job. Is this what they're trying to do? They're trying to purposely destroy the economy to bring about this collapse?
This is something I have thought a lot about, and especially the energy and what's really driving this, green climate, obsession that everybody seems to have, whether it's corporations or things with ESG. The Bank for International Settlements is very much involved in this. And there's different ways that I've looked at this. I've listened to people talk about that this could be some sort of a plan to prohibit the pulling down of the energy resources, for example, in the United States or Canada, so that when oil really does get low, we've used up the Middle Eastern, for example, oil, and the oil that we have is still actually here. That actually sounds like it actually halfway makes sense and might not be that bad of an idea. But then there are people that will talk about abiotic oil and that there's more than enough that we have it. What I can only see with the climate agenda is it's an attempt to essentially control through the electric grid. So you think about what is a big difference between fuel and the electricity. And one of the things with the electric grid is, number one, it's suspect to EMPs. It's much more centralized control. We all know and have a history of blackouts. And when a blackout happens, what do people that are prepared do? They go to a generator to the fuel, much like gold and silver, which can be encapsulated. In fact, I'm kind of holding a silver coin right now in my hands, much like gold and silver that you can actually own and hold and no one can take it from you and you've got it in your hand. It's the same thing with things like oil and coal. It's not the same thing with electricity. And so the energy source, which is much more manipulable for control, is electricity. And so I think that's part of what is behind this.
And this ultimately is, I guess, what the World Economic Forum means when they say you will own nothing and be happy. Are they going to literally evict us from the homes that we own? What's going to happen with our assets?
So I believe that essentially it's going to be, and this is an analogy in the documentary, I believe, or in a similar video that I've watched. It's kind of like we're all playing a game of Monopoly right now. And what this is going to do, it's going to end that game, and all the houses and all the hotels and all the money is going to come back into this central, economic control. The bank, the government, whatever new world order, a globalist economy, whatever could happen as a result of this, it could lead to war, whatever comes down the pike. And at the end of it, what they then are going to do is say, well, look, legally you now have nothing, but would you like to borrow something? Where would you? And now the debt slavery begins again, where they have all the assets, we have nothing. And we're going to let you live in a house. They need their workers to live somewhere. But they're going to have that financial control mechanism in place to say, well, you thought you owned your house outright, but you didn't because it was tokenized and then it was taken. And now do you want to live in your house? Sure, but you're gonna need to borrow from us. And now you once again are putting us into this perpetual debt slavery. And not only that, but they have the opportunity to reorchestrate and reorganize it in whatever way that they see fit from a social justice perspective,
right.
Or
In
a
other
financial
words,
inclusion.
In other words, 5 families that recently arrived into Canada will also be living in your house.
Exactly. It's a massive redistribution. So they collect all the board pieces and then they get to redistribute it however they want. And then they do so through the mechanism of placing debt.
Aren't they afraid of, this, if true, should cause a revolution? People should be rioting in the streets. Are they not worried about that? Or is that what they want? Maybe they want to instigate something.
I think these types of things are things that people that pay attention to it, they see coming, but that a large group of us, unfortunately, prefers, in a maybe a self protective way, not to focus on. So they don't want to really almost believe that this could actually happen or is true, despite the fact that history is full of these exact types of situations. You can look at Germany and the confiscation of assets that happened there. The same thing happened in Japan. And this is just, 60, 70 years ago. And you can go back to what happened in the United States in the Great Depression less than 100 years ago. And you can go throughout history and find that it's not very uncommon for these massive economic type collapses or hyperinflation, these types of things to have. They happen in places like Argentina in the 1980s. So even in our lifetimes, you can see examples of this. But yet, even though the writing's on the wall, people have a hard time admitting that this is coming. So I think a great example, I was just rereading a history of the Pacific battles of World War II. And the author was talking about December 7th in Hawaii. And even though, people were preparing for a war against Japan, the United States knew that Japan was gearing up for a war in the Pacific. On December 7th, when the Japanese bombers were coming, even naval officers believed it was all a drill. They saw it happening. They were watching it, saying, wow, this is an amazing drill. They even painted the rising sun on our planes to make it look like Japanese planes. They thought that the smoke was smoke bombs. When they saw that there was actual damage occurring, they thought that someone had messed up and loaded live ammunition onto our planes. So
that's what you call normalcy bias, right? Normalcy bias.
Exactly. They didn't want to admit it, even when it was happening, even when the bombs were dropping. They could not believe that this was occurring. It was outside of their realm of possibility. And I think something like this is a little bit outside of the realm of possibility in certain people's imaginations. Yet we know from history and from other types of similar situations that it's well within the realm of possibility.
How do we stop it? Or if we can't stop it, how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our private property?
Exactly. I think, underlying this, and there's a previous episode where we talk about this. I talk about some of this stuff in my book, Quaz. A lot of this comes down to the bankers, to the central banks and these international finance organizations, the deep economic state, places like the Bank for International Settlements. I think if we really wanted to try to head this off, and there would be sacrifice, but ultimately I think there needs to be a push to abolish or reorganize the central banks of the world. I think, you have a situation, for example, in the United States with the Federal Reserve, which is owned by its member banks. There's no reason why this shouldn't be taken back into the people in the same way that Andrew Jackson basically destroyed the second central bank of the United States and put us where the national government can be the direct issuer of money. And then I think the other situation is with the legal situation with these laws. More people to talk to their state legislatures about the Uniform Commercial Code. And especially here in the United States, where I feel that our Congress is almost incapable of doing anything, we do have a constitutionally leaning Supreme Court. And I think that there should essentially be a massive push in the United States to try to get cases into the court system that start to unravel and push back upon the constitutionality of some of these things that maybe the Supreme Court could abolish or take down. So I think there's kind of political and legal actions that can be taken, and there's an educational component. And that if the more that these things occur, the harder it does get for these people to do things, because I just can imagine that the people that ultimately are looking forward to these days, every time they see a program like this or a documentary like The Great Taking, or they hear the average man on the street talking about central bank digital currencies, they're getting worried that their plans are coming out into the open, and it makes it that much harder to execute them. So I think those are good places to start, but it's definitely an uphill battle, and it won't be easy to get the changes in place that are necessary.
Well, if it's too late, let's assume for a moment that it's going through. What else can we do? Is the answer cryptocurrency?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, David Rogers Webb, as you mentioned, he moved his family to Sweden to farmland. He's convinced that this is ultimately a very high likelihood of happening, and he was fortunate enough, I suppose, to have the resources to be able to do something like that. We all don't have those resources. So, to protect ourselves, I do think that, assets like gold and silver are important to own. I do think personally that they're planning on blowing up the financial markets one more time in one more great bubble. And I think they're starting to do it. They're using AI as the rationale. You have companies like NVIDIA that are now worth over $2 trillion, more than half of the value of the entire Canadian stock exchange. And so I think that, the next year or two, we could see stock markets around the world continue to go up to new highs. And what that's going to do is going to suck people's money into it. People will get FOMO, fear of missing out. They'll put more and more of their assets in there. And then that's when the collapse can happen, probably 2 to 3 years from now. So I would advise people to be careful of that. If you're going to ride this bubble and keep your money in places like the stock market, make sure that you're aware of how to sell those securities as quickly as possible. Once the bombs start falling, the economic Pearl Harbor comes and the bombs start falling, you can at least try to get your money out before the entire paperwork goes through the mill and the confiscation occurs. So there are certain things to prepare. It's like I said, it's not going to be easy, and there's a lot of work ahead.
Mel Madison, the author of Quaz, a financial thriller, melmadison.com. The links are in the episode notes. Mel, thank you so much. This is pretty chilling.
Thank you, Richard.
Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there.